Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the first chapter in the book of Deuteronomy. We're going to try and make it all the way up to the 25th verse, which is a little past the halfway point in this chapter of 46 verses. Now, the word Deuteronomy itself translates as a repetition of the law. So much of the law that they had received at Sinai and had guided and governed them throughout the wilderness was going to have to be applied as they moved from a wandering nomadic people to a settled agrarian stationary people. So they were a nation on the move, soon to be a settled nation. And the who, what, when, where, and why is the foundation I want to proceed from. Who is the nation of Israel? Moses is the speaker of this. And this book has a more distinctly sermonic and personal tone than its two predecessors, Leviticus and Numbers, which are presented in very matter-of-fact terms. This is a little more, has a more eloquent flow to it. This is Moses' farewell address of sorts. He is nearing the end of his life, and they are literally at the outskirts of the promised land. The what we already mentioned is a repetition of the law. So what they had learned on Sinai, they would have to apply and live in their new location. Where they are at Kadesh Barnea, which is across the Jordan River, which forms the eastern extremity of the Promised Land. And why is because we've already mentioned they had to live by this law. Now, the Mosaic law, which wasn't from Moses, it was given to Moses from Yahweh, but it had three central components. The moral law, this is mostly derivative of the Decalogue. This was to govern their morality, and they also had the social or civil law, which was to govern their secular society, and also a ceremonial law. But we actually don't touch too much on the latter in at least the passage we're going to be covering today. That being said, we're going to hop right to it. Opening verse. These are the words which Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan in the wilderness, in the desert plain opposite Suph, between Paran and Tophel and Laban and Heshtekar and Dizibab, 11 days from Horeb by way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. Kadesh Barnea is, remember, the location they are at this moment in time, and it's located some 11 miles by 11 days walking distance from Sinai. So they had spent 40 years walking and wandering in circles, and we'll get to why, because this recovers much of their history. So Moses kind of elaborates on their history, because a nation without history is like a person without identity. If you do not know your history, you will not know your destination. You will be oriented towards no constructive cause or anything along those lines. And it came to be in the 40th year, in the 11th month, on the first of the month, that Moses spoke to the children of Israel, according to all that Yahweh had commanded him concerning them. Now, this would have been the 40th year of their wilderness wanderings, and Moses' life of 120 years can be conveniently categorized into three distinct 40-year periods. The first 40 years he spent as an Egyptian prince in royalty, and then he finds out he's a Hebrew and slays an Egyptian taskmaster in defense of one of the newfound brothers he's abusing. Then he becomes a Midianite shepherd for 40 years. Then he's called and summoned to this great purpose of leading, calling the Pharaoh to let his people go and working wonders through Yahweh's hands in order to accomplish that effect. And he also leads them throughout the wilderness. Now, I've heard geographically precise dating of this occasion as 1406 BM, before Messiah, and he's telling them everything that Yahweh had commanded concerning them. So this would have been the law, which was to govern and guide their daily living and their society as a whole. After he had smitten Sihon, king of the Amorites, who dwelt at Heshbon, and Og, king of Bashan, who dwelt at Ashtaroth and Ediel. These we can read of in the 21st chapter of the book of Numbers. The Amorites were one of the neighboring nations, indigenous inhabitants to the land they were resettling. And Og was a giant of some 13 feet in stature. He was a literal giant. And the presence of literal giants in the Promised Land was the entire reason why they wandered for 40 years. So in Numbers 13, we read of the scouting expedition, which leads, and 10 of the 12 scouts, each one is selected as a representative of the 12 tribes of Israel, report with the fearful course of action, because the literal giants, they think they don't have in themselves what it takes to conquer this land. And of course they didn't, but they had everything they needed in Yahweh to conquer these people. And Joshua and Caleb alone, respectively, from the tribes of Ephraim and Judah, I believe, give the faithful course of advice to go in and enter the land. And they could have done it in a remarkable short of time. They spent this 40-year wandering period over an area the size of New Jersey. And remember, it's only 11 days. This is back in Exodus 19, where we find them at Sinai, and their 11 days walk location, but they had spent 40 years just to get there. Beyond the Jordan, in the land of Moab, Moses overtook to declare this law, saying, so Moab is the nation and people of one of the nations that was sired through the incestuous liaison between Lot and one of his daughters. His wife had died when looking back at Sodom and was turned into a pillar of salt. So in order to perpetuate his lineage, his daughters get him drunk. One of the nations that spring from his loins is the nation of Moab. They would be a more or less perpetual menace to Israel as a neighboring nation. But Moses is undeclaring the law which had been given to him and which often bears his name. We referred to it as the Mosaic law, but as I already qualified, it's really Yahweh's law given through Moses. Yahweh our Elohim spoke to us in Horeb, saying, you have dwelt long enough at this mountain. This brings us back to Exodus, the range of the 20th chapters, when we find there in Sinai, when we find them there. Turn and depart on your way, and go into the mountains of the Amorites, and go to all the neighboring places in the desert plain, in the mountains, and in the low country, and in the Negeb, and on the sea coast, to the land of the Canaanites, and to Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Perath. So after spending enough time to accomplish the purpose that they had been sent to Sinai, they were instructed to be on the move. They would go to settle and displace the indigenous inhabitants of this land which had been promised to them, and it stretched the seacoast. That would have been the Mediterranean, and the Canaanites were the name of the aboriginal inhabitants. They were descendants of Ham, and as a consequence of Ham not uncovering his father's nakedness, an issue was cursed on his grandson Canaan. One of the descendants of Shem, the Israelite people, would rule them. And Lebanon was the nation to the north, and the great river would have been the Euphrates, which was the western one of the Tigris and Euphrates, the cradle of civilization, where civilization first sprang. See, I have put the land before you. Go in and possess the land which Yahweh swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give them and their seed after them. So this land had been promised to the patriarchs of their people, which were Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they had spent much time in the land. But what happened in Jacob's day is a severe famine struck the land, and one of his sons had been providentially arranged to be in Egypt to interpret the Pharaoh's dream, to anticipate this disaster, and to respond accordingly with a systematic plan where they would collect the years of abundance. So they had 7 years of abundance before 7 years of famine. But Jacob did insist that he be buried in the same location that Abraham and Isaac were, but the Israelite people remained in Egypt. Originally 70 people, then they grew as a nation into a nation and were enslaved because what happened is the restoration of the new kingdom, which witnessed the resurgence of native Egyptian control of their country, resulted in xenophobia, and the Pharaoh, who knew not Joseph, was concerned that these people might side against an enemy attacker because he couldn't trust their loyalty, even though Joseph had tremendously served one of his predecessor pharaohs. And I spoke to you at that time, saying, I am unable to bear you by myself. So Yahweh has limits, his patience has limits. There comes a time where he can stand sin and wickedness no longer, and the sin of the wandering wilderness of Israel was that of murmuring and complaining. They often succumbed to idolatry, beginning with the golden calf in Exodus 32, which Aaron constructs whilst Moses is on the mountain receiving the revelation for this grand tabernacle to come. And also Balaam, the soothsayer, the Mesopotamian soothsayer, of whom we read of in Numbers 22 through 24. In the 25th chapter, he compels them to intermix sexually with the Moabites, and they lead them into idolatry. So their wilderness period was defined by rebellion largely. Yahweh your Elohim has increased you, and see, you are today as numerous as the stars of the heaven. This promise was given to Abraham that wherever he looked, be it the sky in heaven or the seashore on earth, whether he looked above or below, he would have a reminder that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky or the sand on the seashore. And that had been fulfilled this day. They were a nation not yet settled, but they were, for all intents and purpose, a nation of people with a distinct ethnic identity, and more than that, a unique relationship with the one who had created them. All the rest of the world was estranged from their creator. Israel was selected for the purpose of being in a living relationship with him and bearing a visible and verbal witness to Yahweh to the nations all around them. Yahweh Elohim of your fathers is going to add to you 1,000 times more than you are, and bless you as he has spoken to you. Now, this 1,000 times promise is in reference to population. I actually saw a prosperity gospel heretic issue a commercial on television once suggesting that if they donated to his church $1,000, they would become millionaires. So they were perverting and manipulating this promise to money when, as we read in the previous verse, it's clearly a reference to population, but he was going to bless them as he had been spoken to them. That means Yahweh's word and promise are as good as the one who they come from. And how do I bear your pressure and your burden and your strife by myself? So Yahweh had reached, his tolerance had limits. He can only tolerate sin, iniquity, and rebellion for so long, yet he preserved them for the purpose. At one point, he offered to wipe out the entire nation and build a nation from Moses' loins, and Moses is sort of put to the test. He realized that Yahweh had already promised Abraham this nation from him, so Moses correctly intercedes, reminding him of his promise, which of course Yahweh already knew. So whenever Yahweh asks a question, it's always and only to test us. It's not because he lacks any information, because he's an omniscient being. That's the attribute of unlimited or infinite intelligence. Choose men, wise and understanding, and known to your tribes, and let me appoint them as your heads. So the organizational division would have been determined according to tribe. They would have been men of reputation and renown, and they would have been exalted into leadership roles. And you answered me and said, the word which you have spoken to us to do is good. So the Israelites had verbally affirmed the commandment they had been received and the instruction they had been imparted, but they did not always live up to it or enact it or embody it or apply it. And I took the heads of your tribes, wise men and known, and made them heads over you, leaders of thousands, and leaders of hundreds, and leaders of 50s, and leaders of 10s, and officers for your tribe. So there was a systematic organization within the range of numbers within each tribe. We read here thousands, hundreds, 50s, and 10s was the numerical nature of these divisions and the structure of their leadership. And I commanded your judges at that time, saying, when hearing between your brothers, judge righteously between a man and his brother, or the stranger who is with them. So their justice is to be derivative and reflective of his own justice, and he expounds on this more fully in the verse which comes after it. But for now, it suffices to say that the stranger and the native, there was no legal distinction between the foreigners, the ethnic outsiders who dwelled in their covenant community, between the native Israelites. And of course, he wants them to rule justly for the maintenance and functioning and flourishing of a just society that cannot exist apart from the equitable jurisprudence. Do not show partiality in judging. Hear the small as well as the great. Do not be afraid of anyone's face, for the judgment belongs to Elohim. And the case which is too hard for you, bring it to me, and I shall hear it. So we are to be impartial in our ruling. It's human nature to favor the rich at the expense of the poor, because let's face it, we can get more out of the rich. We want to cultivate their good graces, but Yahweh says no. Forsake the natural man's natural inclination to favor and treat disproportionately, and to let the rich get away with something you'd punish the poor for. He says there to be total equality before the law. We are equally accountable, equally responsible, and equally punishable, but also in such cases which will tax their imagination as to what the just course of action is. In such situations, they are to surrender in prayer to the decision, and they have the promise that he will lead them and he will guide them and he will show them the correct judgment to implement and pursue. So he's never more than prayer away, and his ears are always attentive to the cries of justice. So that's not in his nature to reject a prayer for the wisdom to implement justice, which is reflective of his own. And I commanded you at that time all the words which you should do. Then we departed from Horeb and went through all that great and awesome wilderness which you saw on the way to the mountains of the Amorites, as Yahweh our Elohim had commanded us. And we came to Kadesh Barnea. So he's taking them back through history and geography. These sites would have been familiar to all present. They would have known the mountains of the Amorites. These were the inhabitants of their territory. And Kadesh Barnea was where they found themselves now. They were literally across the promised land, and Moses' purpose in gathering them was to give his final and farewell address. So these words are his last will and testament, and his parting words are to be treated. Now, what a man says before he has to die is perhaps, you would like to think something of extraordinary significance. And I said to you, you have come to the mountains of the Amorites, which Yahweh is giving us. See, Yahweh your Elohim has put the land before you. Go and possess it, as Yahweh Elohim of your fathers has spoken to you. Do not fear, nor be discouraged. So they could have possessed this land, which was across the river from them 38 years ago, if they had only eliminated the fear within them of the scouts who had reported they were walking by sight, not faith. Joshua and Caleb alone advised the faithful course of action, which was that Yahweh is with us, no giant or army, no matter how big the giant, the person, or the army, those who war Yahweh's war with him on their behalf, there is no enemy which can conquer them or defeat them in any way. But tragically, they had to be told again to go up and possess it, and Moses would not live to enter into the promised land on account of one sin. I forget which one, in all honesty, but in any case, he was permitted a view of it. This we read of in the 34th and final chapter of this book. And all of you came near me and said, let us send men before us, and let them search out the land for us, and bring back word to us of the way by which we should go up, and of the cities by which we would come. So that their lapse of faithfulness actually begins when they send scouts among them, because scouts, they're investigating by sight, the eyes of sight and not of faith. So if they had only trusted him and had not relied on these scouts who actually came back with the cowardly course of action which swayed the multitudes and the masses, they could have had the land. They could be already settled and flourishing there, but for a wise purpose, they were determined. Yahweh had determined to make them wait, and he would refine them through the wilderness experience. And the matter was good in my eyes. So I took 12 of your men, 1 man from each tribe. This is the 12 tribes of Israel. Joshua and Caleb, remember, were respectively representative of Ephraim and Judah. So the scouting party, there were 12 of them, each representative of the single of the 12 tribes. And they turned and went up into the mountains, and came to the Wadi Escal, and spied it out. So they came to do what they did. They were a scouting expedition, delegated and authorized for that purpose at the behest of the masses. And the final verse we're going to cover today. And they took some of the fruit of the land in their hands, and brought it down to us. And they brought back word to us, saying, the land which Yahweh, our Elohim, is giving us is good. So they came with fruits and clusters that which conclusively confirmed that this was in fact the land of milk and honey that Yahweh had promised Moses as early as Exodus 3:8 and 17. So there was they had food to entice them, but the people in it was their detriment. So the existence of literal giants was the obstacle to them seizing what should have belonged to them some 38 years ago. But if you hesitate or delay or act in cowardice or let your fear govern you, then you will not claim the blessings like you should. So I hope that's the reason you're here today. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.